And quite honestly, Tim, in the beginning, people would tell us that this was not journalism, that it was advocacy. And so I always think about that now because journalism has changed so much, even in those few years. And things like information needs assessment, service journalism, the model that we have are sort of the things that funders want to see newsrooms doing. It is the thing that many of the new and emerging newsrooms are built off of.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. Last week's episode marked a return after a 6-week hiatus as I was consumed by planning for the 146th annual Colorado Press Association convention, which took place in late August. The convention featured many podcast guests, including Jay Rosen, Kenny Katzgrau, Dan Gretsch, Jeff Roberts, Raleigh Burley, Todd Chamberlain, Corey Hutchins, Joaquin Alvarado, Dave Perry, Barbara Hart, Frank Muncham, and more, including this week's guest, Candice Fortman, who gave the Hall of Fame keynote. Candice continues my occasional exit interview series, conducted just after she announced her resignation as executive director of Outlier Media. Candice has been a transformative force in local journalism, leading Outlier Media with a unique approach to meeting the information needs of Detroit residents. As she prepares to embark on her JSK Fellowship at Stanford University, we reflect on her journey at Outlier, the innovative journalism model she helped shape, and her thoughts on the future of local news. I enjoyed this conversation so much, and I hope you see why. Candice's insights into community engagement, her thoughts on the challenges of scaling journalism with real impact, and her vision for the future are insightful and inspiring, and she's just fun to talk to. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com, or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Candice Fortman. All right. Well, welcome, Candice. Thanks for being on the podcast.
I'm so excited to talk to you today, Tim.
Oh, me too. I met you shortly after you started at Outlier Media. What was that, 2018, 2019, something like that?
I think early 2019.
Yeah. And have always been impressed with you and what you've done. And now you have, I guess, just turned over the reins.
That's right.
And you are on your way to California for your second JSK Fellowship, this one on site and in person.
Right. The real thing, as they say, the real thing.
So I'm excited for you. That was one of the best times of my life. So
that's what I keep hearing. And I'll tell you that the thing that attracted me to JSK has been the alum of the program. I have not ever met a more generous, thoughtful, innovative group of human beings. And every time I come across someone who has been a JSK alum, there is a through line of kindness that cannot be denied.
Yes, I think one of their key selection criteria is that no assholes rule.
I think Dawn says no brilliant jerks.
Yes, that's it. That's her phrase.
But that other part works as well. Same difference. It means the same thing.
So as you have wrapped things up on Outlier Media, I've been doing an occasional series of exit interviews or just giving people an opportunity to reflect on their experiences and what they've learned. But maybe we should start real quick with just a summary of what Outlier Media is and the role you played.
Yeah, Outlier Media is a nonprofit newsroom serving Detroiters. And we have a model of journalism that was actually created at the JSK Fellowship by our founder and editor-in-chief, Sarah Alvarez. And more than, because this is an exit interview, more than founder-in-chief, one of the most important people in my life. And so Sarah was, when she did her JSK fellowship, what she was trying to figure out is how can newsrooms, one, identify what information needs a community has and how to address those information needs. So how do we figure out what the resources of journalism and what the resources of a newsroom should actually be applied to that could change the material and lived lives of a community. And at that time in the beginning, we were really focused on crisis level needs. So because we had limited resources, we focused on the things that Detroiters most needed to know. So every year or so, we do an information needs assessment that Sarah has been doing since the very beginning when it was just a one person shop in 2016. And that information needs assessment is done over text message. And we will come back to text messaging because that's an important part of our methodology. And we ask a representative group of Detroiters a series of questions to figure out what Detroiters are struggling to get good information about in order to change their lives. So we ask those questions over text message, but we also look at public record information, non-emergency 911 calls, calls to United Way to see what people are asking questions about, but more importantly, what are people complaining about? Because complaint data is a real good indicator of where problems and accountability gaps exist in your community. And so from that information needs assessment, that is how we establish our beats of reporting. So in the beginning, we had two beats of reporting, housing and utilities. Those were Detroiters' biggest information gaps. And for a number of reasons. And one of the things I love about information needs assessments is that you could say that housing can be an information gap anywhere in the country, right? Particularly right now. But in Detroit, and I'm sure this is true in other communities, that information crisis looked like a tax foreclosure crisis in the early years of Outlier because of policies and regulations that were unique to this region. Where I'm going in California, I am positive based on my research, it would be a rent crisis because the price of rent is pretty high. And so that allowed us to really take our very limited resources. When I say limited, Sarah was sort of in the beginning, I think she was doing this off thoughts and prayers. And so there was no investment in this. And quite honestly, Tim, in the beginning, people would tell us that this was not journalism, that it was advocacy. And so I always think about that now because journalism has changed so much, even in those few years. And things like information needs assessment, service journalism, the model that we have are sort of the things that funders want to see newsrooms doing. It is the thing that many of the new and emerging newsrooms are built off of. Things like things like documenters that comes out of City Bureau. So anyhow, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm rambling. I'm saying so many things.
No, that's all great. And I want to dig into a lot of the different aspects of that. But I'll sort of get to there by just pointing out that, as you said, a lot of people did not understand the model because it did not look like normal journalism. And the funding wasn't there early on, right? It was a shoestring. It was Sarah's passion project. I think when you got there, I think I read that the budget was something like $75,000.
That is what we had in the bank. $72,600 was in that bank account.
And by now you've raised, what is it, over $7 million from philanthropy?
I think I have to do the numbers. I don't know if it's quite 7 million, but our operating budget is just over $2 million this year.
So that's a lot of growth, and people have started to see the wisdom in what you're doing. And when I don't know how the model has evolved, so maybe we can actually start there. When I became aware of what Sarah was doing, I think she actually, the seed of the idea, my understanding, is started when she came to Macon, Georgia, where I was at the Center for Collaborative Journalism. Andrew Haig put on an Information Needs of the Poor conference, and Jay Hamilton at Stanford was one of the guests.
Shout out to Jay Hamilton. He is, if there's a foundational base of Outlier, Jay Hamilton's work is the base of what we do.
And so, a lot of the journalism in those early days was what I've described as bespoke journalism, right? It's answering questions for a person and tracking down that information, which is not how we think of journalism, but it is very much in the line of how, a savvy, smart startup in Silicon Valley might think about, do things that don't scale before you scale so that you know the needs of the people you're serving. Yeah. So talk about that model and then how it evolved and scaled.
I think if we would have called it bespoke journalism, we might have made money. If you call something a bespoke bar, all of a sudden it's the fanciest thing in town. So, the beautiful thing about not having any money is that it makes you really good at managing the money you have. And it makes you think really critically about what you actually need to invest in order to keep the doors open, in order to keep going. And so when we were in the early days, it was critical that we were only doing the things that would have the highest impact for Detroiters. And so only focusing on housing and really only at that time focusing on tax foreclosure was critical. And I like think of the tax foreclosure infrastructure now is a completely different thing. And a lot of that early work that Sarah was doing can be can has attributed to that. Also, looking at utilities, which utilities is an incredibly hard beat to cover. People aren't like rushing to cover utilities. And in Detroit, our utility company is a private company. And so it really takes years of building the sort of rigor in reporting in order to even make a dent in that reporting. But because of the way we were set up, that we weren't trying to go after ad dollars, we weren't trying to build a website, we didn't care about social shares, we could focus only on the things Detroiters needed to know because that was the model. And I will tell you that it ensured that we did not make payroll for ourselves more than a few times over the years. But when I think about the sacrifice we made, and we can talk a bit about I think that that sacrifice is a bad thing, and we can talk about that. But the sacrifice that we made, the way that we built, allowed us to be here today. And more importantly, not just doing work in Detroit, but my hope, and I think it's true, is that we have influenced the way journalism is done in many communities outside of Detroit. And that is not what we were focused on, but it is a beautiful outcome of just staying the course in our own work.
And so when you started, I think a large part of your job was raising money. Is that correct?
When I started, a large part of my job was doing everything. you know, when it was three of us at that time, and we had nothing. We were a fiscally sponsored project. We were not a newsroom. We were not also in Tim. Let me be very clear. We were not intending to become a newsroom. When I first started, the thing that Sarah really wanted me to figure out is what should we do with this model? Because it wasn't a newsroom. We were doing reporting, but we didn't have an official publishing website. We were not trying to build a publishing website. We did most of our long form reporting in collaboration with other newsrooms, meaning we published on other people's platforms and gave all that reporting away for free. And so our thinking it was that we would merge or sell off the model to someone else. And funny enough, Tim, no one cared. Nobody, nobody wanted to pay us for this model. Nobody really wanted to merge what we were doing into their existing infrastructure. And so we found over time that we just were not going to be able to figure it out. And we actually did enter into a merger in early January of 2020 with MuckRock in Boston. And we were going to go off and build news products for other newsrooms and build responsive news products, built on this methodology of service journalism. And then March of 2020 happened. And we had built, and I think the thing that I did miss talking about in the beginning is that the other part of what we do is that from the very beginning, we have delivered our reporting via an SMS platform, so via text message. And that's not long form reporting. We're not pushing out long form articles. Detroiters can text into us or we can text out to Detroiters and can get information like, for instance, if you need to see if your landlord is paying the property taxes on your house. We've scraped the Wayne County Treasurer's Office website, put it in this platform. You can put your address right from your phone, whether you have a smartphone or a free government phone, and it will tell you if your landlord is current on their property taxes. And during COVID, if you needed to figure out where the closest testing center is to your zip code, if you needed to figure out where the closest food bank was, because during COVID, we did a special information needs assessment, and for the first time, food insecurity came up as an information gap. And so our ability to be able to respond quickly and like indirectly to people's questions. And in that text system, there's always an option to speak directly to a reporter in our newsroom. And within 48 hours, someone will answer your question directly if it is not something that is automated in the text system. So when we talk about bespoke journalism, it is truly one-to-one journalism. It is keeping people both out of crisis, but also being able to catch an emerging crisis. Because sometimes people will text into us and alert us of something that might be emerging, like flooding or a power outage that's only impacting one small community, and they can't get any help for that power outage. So really being able to also identify where problems are starting to emerge.
Mm-hmm. And yet the texting aspect of course, been what a lot of people have found so fascinating about Outlier Media. And I don't think enough people have learned how they can use SMS. So talk a little bit about, particularly in the early days, how did you get word out? What kinds of questions were you getting in? And then how did that feed into the systems that you ended up building and the deeper reporting you ended up doing?
So if someone was to ask me where our early investment went, I would say it went fully into the tech system. From paying for the very expensive platform, it is not an inexpensive thing, even though it's an outdated technology. But the thing that we did is because when you are a small startup newsroom, the one thing you do not have outside of money is you don't have money to do the actual reporting, and you certainly don't have money to do marketing. So you can't tell anybody that you exist. And so Sarah very smartly decided in the beginning to start buying marketing lists. And it's funny because I come from a marketing background where I used to do this for much more terrible reasons. But Sarah did it for much more useful reasons. So she would buy the same marketing list that I used to buy. And over time, we purchased almost every phone number that was available in the city of Detroit. And that is how we were able to push those text messages out to people and to let folks know that this service existed. Because when we didn't have, we couldn't buy billboards, we couldn't buy radio ads. And so we decided we just had to go and find our audience on our own. And so that is sort of how we developed the SMS system. We actually are now in beta testing and it will launch in the next couple of months. We've built our own SMS service because we found over time that many of the services are just not built to work exactly how we work. And so actually using the same firm that built the back end of the Documenters project out of City Bureau, we have built our own text messaging platform that is incredible, and really takes that sort of one-to-one reporting up a notch, completely. And so that SMS service is critical to our work. It's how we get sourcing for stories. It is how we alert our community. Like, for instance, thanks to climate change, there's now a flood zone in the city of Detroit. And so being able in this new text system, we'll be able to text out to everybody who's in the zip code where that flood zone exists and get them critical information when we see flooding is on the horizon. Or after flooding has happened, how will they get in touch with the federal government, with FEMA? How should they navigate that? They can let us know if they're having a hard time navigating those forms. And so really thinking about building a responsive tool that can work both on an every single day basis for average everyday needs, but also, I think more importantly, in an ever-changing world at times where information can keep people safe in a crisis. And so coming out of that, we entered that merger with MuckRock thinking we would do that for other people. And then COVID, of course, happened. We had built this platform that was made for a crisis. And here we were off doing something totally different. And so shout out to Michael Morrissey, who's also a JSK alum. We, in April of 2020, said to him, we actually need to stop. We need to pull out of this merger and we need to try this outlier thing again. We need to go back to our community and do the thing that we do, which was to keep people safe in a crisis. And so I'm always so grateful to Michael and his leadership for understanding why that was not going to work in that moment. And I think it has worked for both of our organizations incredibly well. And so we pulled out of the merger, decided, Sarah and I, that we were going to build a newsroom. For the first time, that was the first time we said we're going to build a newsroom. And so April 2020 is sort of like, I always say Outlier has like four founding dates. And I think April 2020 is one of those founding dates.
Yeah. So I want to, before we get onto other topics, I'm thinking about, newsrooms who are fascinated by this idea. Maybe they have a little money to experiment. Maybe they get a grant and they're just trying to think through what does this look like in the beginning? So, as Sarah's starting this, and I think, this was probably still the motor operation in 2019 when I was up there. So I go buy a marketing list or I put up QR codes or something. What am I asking people, and what kinds of things are you sending out, blasting out if it's more broadcast in those early days? How are you getting people interested and saying, hey, this can actually meet your information needs?
Well, the first thing is that you need to approach whatever technology you use from a human standpoint. And so even to this day, when you get a text message from us, it says, "Hi, this is Sarah Alvarez from Outlier Media." It doesn't just say this is Outlier Media because nobody cares about Outlier Media. But people care about a human being that they can go and maybe Google and see that that's a real person. And so the first place to start is to figure out, regardless, how you're going to humanize the connection between the reporting in your community. And so for us, it looks like, "Hi, this is Sarah." In the very beginning, are you having a hard time with taxes or with utilities? Text one for housing, text two for utilities, text three for something else. And then also making sure that you understand the language barriers in your community. And so for us, our text service is available in English, Spanish, and Arabic because those are the three languages most spoken in Detroit. That is hard. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to start that way because you might not have the money, because that is an investment because you should be paying the people who do your translations to do your translations. But as you start to build the system up, and that's why I always tell people, I think that folks see something like Outlier, and I remember feeling that way when I first started, that I needed to build the entire elephant on day one. I needed to have the whole thing figured out. And instead, what actually made it much more achievable was that I focused on just building the tail first, just building the legs. And then eventually I looked up and there was a whole elephant sitting in our newsroom. And Sarah would look at, we would look at each other and say, where did these people come from? What is happening? And it also worked for our community because at the same rate, we were able to build trust with our community and get sort of those folks in community that are really good at extending their personal trust and their personal brand to say, these folks are legit. You can trust them. They are the real deal. And that is, I feel, and we could be wrong, we'll find out. Everybody's on the same course. This is a very young industry, but I really do feel like that is an incredible way to build sustainable trust with your community. As opposed to just dropping in one day with, all splashy and fancy, and here we are, a newsroom. I think that I look at something like even folks who started with more infrastructure, something like the Oakland side, out of city side in California. I love the way that Tasneem built the beginnings of what became the Oakland side. Before the Oakland side had a name, they were doing a year's worth of community listening sessions, going into different neighborhoods in Oakland, sitting down and listening to people before they printed a single word. And so there was already a relationship built with community before they even had a publishing website. And I think that that for me has been one of the things that has sustained us over time, even when nobody knew what we were doing or who we were. Folks were like, "Oh, yeah, they helped me stay in my house. They helped me figure out how to get my utility bills paid." When you can actually do something for people, return material possessions back to them, keep them in their house, keep their lights and water on, they have a real easy time telling their aunts, cousins, sisters, brothers, and neighbors to trust you as well. And that is an incredible way to build community.
So I want to talk a little bit about, to kind of build on that, just the importance of the information needs, particularly for underserved communities, for low income communities. I think a lot of Americans, particularly a lot of Americans of privilege, economic privilege, racial privilege, we know local news is important and we listen to our NPR and it's so much about Trump and, national politics. But for low income communities, it's about not getting kicked out of your house or you're having your electricity being turned off or, a factory closing or all of these other things. So talk a little bit about just sort of, is so much more vital, I think, in many ways, that local, real information. And I don't think we're putting the money we need to into those communities because the economic model isn't there or because those needs aren't understood or what else?
So now we're getting into my favorite topic, which is that journalism is a public good and should be treated that way. It should be treated like turning the lights on. It should be treated like infrastructure, like building highways and streets. And so the real conversation we'll eventually have to have is that if information is a public good, why are you asking individual newsrooms to figure out the business model of journalism? There is no business model for journalism in most local communities. In fact, it is not a business. It is a public good. But that's a conversation for another day. And I apologize to all my funders who are probably freaking out and hearing that, but it is true. So, anyhow, um, figuring out the information needs of a community, especially communities where one, maybe there is no journalism organization, where there's no library, where there's no hospital, because we're talking about the other things that serve information gaps when there is no newsroom, because there are ways people get information when there isn't a newsroom that I think that we undercover and underthink about in this industry. And so when you're in communities that are having those sorts of true information gaps, it is vital that you figure out what are the things that people most need to know right now and feel those things first and foremost. Because again, as you said, those are the things that are going to keep people in their houses. Those are the things that keep people's water on, that ensure that the water is clean, right? You look at all the different water issues we're having across the country, figuring out how to get good reporting into those places is vital. The other thing I think that we might need to challenge ourselves to understanding is it might not look like building a full newsroom. There are other ways to bring news infrastructure to a place that doesn't just look like building a full newsroom. It might look like putting a reporter in a library and having them have a help desk at at the local library or at the local farmers market or at the pick and save. It looks like finding ways to get information into community that might not always mirror large cities, right? But then you flip that and you go to large cities where people will tell you, well, there is no, there are no information deserts. There's no information crisis there. But if the infrastructure that exists is only really serving probably the outer ring suburbs, meaning it often means sort of a white elite audience, where those NPR consumers, and we always say, Sarah and I, that those are folks who use news as entertainment, where those are the folks that are sitting at dinner tables or dinner parties on a Saturday and say, "Did you hear on NPR?" As opposed to when information actually keeps you in place. And so I think the other thing, and this was the thing I was trying to remember before, I think the thing that is also misunderstood is that right now is a great example of this. We keep hearing on the nightly news in national headlines that there is no recession happening. But if I ask Detroiters, is there a recession happening? Many of them will tell me there is. Because there is a recession happening for a segment of our country. There is a recession happening for people who do not have college educations. There is a recession happening for people who don't own their homes. There is a recession happening for people who are trying to pay rent with college degrees that don't pay the price of rent. That feels like a personal recession. And I can't deny those people's lived truth. And so an information needs assessment also helps you understand the difference between a truth that exists for sort of like the umbrella of people as opposed to the truth that exists for a segment of your community. Because two things can be true at the same time.
Absolutely. Talk to me a little bit about arriving at Outlier. So you had a marketing background. What was it that attracted you to what Sarah was doing? Yeah, why did this become a passion for you?
Yeah, so before coming to Outlier, my immediate job was working at the public radio station in Detroit. Shout out to WDET. And so at WDET, and in all of my jobs in media have sat, even when I was in for-profit radio, sat somewhere between production and the business side. And so I was always sort of sitting in the gap of those two things. And in all of those jobs, really trying to figure out how do we take the resources of the business side and actually make them useful to the audience. I can see that through line now. I couldn't see it until recently, but I can see that that has been the job the whole time. And so I remember when Sarah first asked me if I would come and be her boss. That's like, those were the words she used. I'm a reporter. I want to be a reporter. I need a boss. Will you come be my boss? I think I had met Sarah one time before that. And I knew her work because she was at the other public radio station, Michigan Public Radio, which is state serving. And so, and I knew that she was brilliant. And so I looked at her and I said, "No, I can't do that. What are you talking about?" Um, and so that was April of 2018. And that was really about me being short sighted about my own gifts and talents. It had nothing to do with my thoughts about Sarah or what she was building because I'd been paying attention to what she was building. And I thought it was incredible. And so April 2018, I tell her no, but I said, well, let's start working on some projects together. And so we started this working more closely together on a couple of projects, and I got to know her better. And so then in October or November of 2018, we went to a conference in Chicago. We just happened to both be at this conference. And on the way back to Detroit, we're both taking the train back. Shout out to Amtrak not owning their own train lines. So you often get stuck on this route. And so the train couldn't take off that night. So we had to stay an extra night. So we went to dinner together. And by the end of that dinner, I told her I was going to come to Outlier. I think that Sarah is truly one of the most brilliant human beings I will ever have the pleasure of knowing. But she also has a vision for journalism that matched my vision for journalism, but more importantly, my vision for Detroit. I am a Detroiter. I grew up in the city. The city raised me. The city taught me how to love community, how to build community. And as I saw more and more of the folks who made me who I am struggling to stay in place here, figuring out what my role was going to be in making this an easier to not just survive city, but a city that people could thrive in was important to me. It was sort of like, like paying tithes back to the city that gave me everything. And so the opportunity to be able to build something like Outlier in Detroit will, I hope it is in my obituary. I hope that the folks who write that know how important this work has been to me and how important this city and the people of this city will always be to me. And so Outlier, I say many times over, is my love letter to the city of Detroit.
Powerful. So you came there, became Sarah's boss, and have
You can't be Sarah. That's the other thing. You can't be Sarah's boss.
Yeah.
Sarah's not getting Sarah getting a boss is the most hilarious. Anybody who knows Sarah would find that hilarious. Sarah does not need a boss, and Sarah cannot have a boss.
But there were
But
three of
yeah,
you.
sure.
There were three of you when you started. So you've overseen this growth. And I want to talk a little bit about some of that process. But just for you as a leader, how do you think you've grown over that time?
I can hardly recognize myself. And fortunately, I'm really happy about that. The woman who walked into that newsroom in February of 2019 was so unsure of herself, did not understand her value proposition in most things, could not articulate that in a real way, in a way that she actually believed. Also, I had been in these jobs where I had a little bit of power, but not enough to actually create real change, to really experiment, to drive some things forward in a way that didn't require me to ask two or three people up. And this was the first time when someone had trusted me fully and believed in my talents fully and said, you got it, go for it. And so my confidence is much bigger than it was the first day. I have a network of peers in this industry that sometimes I look at my phone and I look who's texting me and I'm like, why do I even know this person? Why how fortunate am I that these are the people I can call and ask for advice that are encouraging me, who I get to encourage. But also it helped me to, I think, see the community work that my mother had been doing as sort of like the foundation of the leader I was eventually going to become. So my mom was a block club president most of my life. And so I've been going to block club meetings. I've been going to community meetings forever. And so understanding that I could bring all of that knowledge, that those were training grounds for me. And I didn't understand why or what it was going to lead to at that point. But all of those things, my life has been leading to this moment and to this work. And so I think the other part of it is that I can just see my path much more clearly. And that also, I think, has something to do with aging, is that you just start to see the timeline much more clearly, why that had to happen in order for this to happen, why all the things that you wanted to happen in your 20s didn't happen for you in your 20s, and that is okay. And so I think that that's a big thing. But the other thing, and I think the biggest part is that I have such an abundance mindset now that I did not have then. I was leading from a place of lack in the very beginning. We didn't have enough money. I didn't have enough talent. We didn't have enough notoriety to get the job done. And somewhere in the middle of 2020, thanks to, I think, a lot of things, having a lot of time alone, I lived alone during the pandemic. Also, the work of an incredible therapist, which I cannot encourage newsroom leaders to invest in their mental health more. I was able to see that a lot of the ways that we were being held back were my own mentality, my own thinking that we were not enough, that we were going to have to oversell ourselves. And so once I really leaned into the fact that we had plenty and that what we had built was incredible, that is where I really started to see massive change happen for both Sarah and I as leaders, but also for the organization as a whole.
I want to go somewhere that is a little, maybe a little risky, but I just feel like going there. So I'll talk about being Black in Detroit. So I have grown up, I grew up in the Deep South in Georgia, and mostly in communities that were had very large Black populations, sometimes majority Black populations. Very different though in the Deep South than in Detroit. And I remember as an adult hearing, I think from multiple Black women in all these cases a couple times where they talked about, Detroit, obviously home to Motown and just a lot of rich cultural heritage and majority Black city. And the first time they went outside of Detroit, they had no idea that people had these perceptions of Black people. And that's such a coming from the Deep South and seeing the struggles of Blacks in the community, even in some of these majority Black communities, they were locked out of power. And to see that people can grow up without that sense of self that so many Black Americans grow up was just eye-opening to me and such a wonderful thing. And I'm wondering if you've had that experience and seen that, and what does that mean to the possibilities of maybe where we could go and how we talk about race.
Detroit is the greatest city on earth. So, I'm deeply biased about this, and I'm okay with that bias. I think that part of why I feel that is exactly what you're hinting at. That I grew up not understanding in a real way some of the limitations my friends felt put on them that grew up in other places. The mayor was Black. The doctors were Black. Everybody's Black. Our mailman was in Black. Like that's the most diversity I saw. Shout out to Danny. Daddy was Polish, and so I think that there was growing up in Detroit in the 80s and 90s. I can say a million things about what it felt like to grow up Black in Detroit at that time because I also say it is very different depending on when you grew up in the city and also what was happening in your home, what community you lived in. Because this is one of the things that I think growing up Black in Detroit did teach me that I think people still struggle with is that Black is not a monolith. My Black experience in Detroit is different than people's Black experience on the other side of town or 6 blocks up because of what was happening in my household, because of the schools I went to, because of other experiences that I got to have, right? Or experiences that I didn't get to have. And so that is the one thing that is for sure in the top of my head all the time. I'm like, yeah, Black folks are different all over the world. And they're different from one side of the city to the other side of the city. I joke all the time, our new executive director, Orlando Bailey, is from the east side of Detroit. And there's sort of this rivalry between the east side and the west side of the city. And you hear folks talk about these two sides of the city, you would think that they were other sides of the planet. They're 6 miles apart from one another, but there is a real culture shift between those two sides of the city. Same, all Black people, completely different cultures in some ways. And so I think that that's one of the things. But the other part about growing up Black in Detroit is that I had the most incredible Black women on earth teaching me, both in formal ways in schools, in communities, in the church that I grew up in, my dance teachers. I mean, they were everywhere. I had no lack of incredible women to look up to, become hopefully one day. And that remains true for me. I'll tell you a short story. I was in this boutique that I go to all the time here in Detroit, Flow Boutique, that's been in this community for more than 20 years. And the woman who owns it, Felicia, is absolutely incredible. And she has built a clothing store that is like a gathering place. I often feel bad for her because I was like, do people come here and buy clothes? Because often people are just sitting here having conversations. It's one of those places. And so I was there last Saturday, and it's one of those places where you run into a bunch of people you know. If you stand there for more than 20 minutes, someone's going to walk through that door that you know. And so this was one of those days where people just kept walking in and they were staying and we were having conversations. And at some point, someone walked in and said, "Have you heard about what Candice is about to do?" And so I don't know if you have any Black women in your life, but if you tell a Black woman that you have won an award, it can be the smallest award. By the time she gets done talking about it, it's going to sound like an Oscar. And so they were like, "She's going to Stanford," and like you would think I had gotten into Stanford Medical School, right? And it was this really beautiful celebration. And the thing that happened next, Tim, I don't even know if I can write about it yet. I do want to write about it. Those women surrounded me and started praying over me. That is the city that I was raised in. That they are willing to send me off, even though they want to keep me here, but they will not send me off without covering me with their love. I can't fathom having been raised anywhere else with any sort of spirit of generosity, kindness, and absolute flyness as the people who call Detroit home.
That's beautiful. A big tangent, but I think it's important to remember that, we talk about local news, but each city has its own flavor and uniqueness, and people have their own uniqueness. And we need to, as hopefully this DEI backlash doesn't grow. I think journalism by and large is not buying into the backlash, but as we hopefully move forward on DEI, that we recognize no group is monolithic, and people have different lived experiences, and you have to get to know people and meet their individual needs, whether that's employees in your newsroom or the communities you serve. All right. Back to Outlier. As you leave, and I don't know how much thought you've given to what's next.
No, I haven't, and also, and I know that sounds silly, and it feels kind of silly too. I do not know what I want to be when I grow up, and that feels a bit ridiculous. But I just said that to a industry leader that I really admire, and I was like, I can't believe I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And she was like, I've never known what I wanted to be. I just keep going forward. And I think that is the energy in which I'm moving ahead. I don't know what the road is going to be. I want to continue contributing to local journalism. I do also, though, deeply want to be able to tell stories. I am a storyteller on my own, but I have spent all of my career mostly not doing that on my own, helping other people do that. And so I do want to find ways to be able to highlight some of the stories and issues that I really think are valuable. And so I don't know what that looks like. Anybody with ideas, please reach out to Tim and he will find me.
Absolutely. So it's conceivable, if not likely, that raising money will be part of what you will do for whatever is next. You certainly did that at Outlier. What advice would you give to people looking back on your experience, particularly if you're doing something for communities that maybe don't have as much economic interest invested in them, or for new ideas like the texting platforms? What advice do you give people to try to get people to take a chance and say this is a worthy cause that you need to invest in?
You are going to have to, especially if you are not well positioned, whatever that means to you. You don't know a bunch of millionaires. You don't have deep connections to the foundation world. And I'm saying these as the troops that I walked into this work with. You're going to have to get incredibly good at telling your story inside of a lens of impact and the impact that matters to the place you serve. I always say that I want to hear I want to be able to smell, taste, and feel the place you're talking about by the time you get done talking about it, because that is what draws folks in and says, yeah, that's a place I want to invest in, even though I've never been there, right? I've been, I've, I think I donate to half the doggone newsrooms in this country at this point, but often it is because I'll read a newsletter or I'll see a tweet and they're telling a story about the work that they do, about the place that they live in, and I want that place to thrive. And so that is, think about that as an innate human nature, how you naturally connect to stories, to what makes you do something, make a call to action. Use that same gut feeling, right? If it's not making you feel like you should give, why would it make anybody else feel like they should? But I think the other part of that is I just said this to an incredible newsroom leader who has a newer newsroom that I think is, I'm just going to say who it is. And I hope that she'll forgive me for this. Lisa Snowden at Baltimore Beat, I think, is building one of the most powerful things in the country. In a moment where everybody is telling us that print won't work, she is utilizing print in a way that is connecting to the folks in Baltimore. But more importantly, look at the innovation of putting newspaper boxes out. And not only is she just, because it's a free paper, not only are they newspaper boxes, but if you need to get Narcan, there's Narcan available in some of those newspaper boxes. There's food available in some of them. Some of them are food pantries. They are in places where folks that are in the community actually hang out in, not the guests of where those places hang out in. She has a whole delivery team. And I told her she needs to put a GoPro on those drivers, because what the stories they're telling about their interactions when they drop off the Baltimore Beat is incredible. For me, Lisa should be on every main stage at every conference in this industry, because that is a story of success, and it is a story that I think people should be investing in, because that's the thing all of us need to be trying to figure out how to do, how to connect to community in an authentic way that also innovates on a thing that already existed, right? Like, she didn't innovate on print. Print already existed. But how can you make your newsroom also a community center? She is figuring out how to do that. And so that story of impact, that story of putting yourself in a position, and that can be hard, especially for folks that are journalists that are doing this work, to put themselves out there to ensure that they become authorities on their community, on the thing that they do. But that is the thing that people want to hear. They want to hear about the people you serve, the place you serve. And if you can center your thought, notice I'm not talking about money. I'm not giving you a single clue on filling out grant forms or, all of it is the same. Right. And it's really, I can't remember what newsroom it is, but their development director is a former reporter. And when they said that to me, I was like, yes, that makes complete sense, because she's a storyteller. And that's 90% of the job.
Well, I'll move to rapid fire questions, but maybe I'll just wrap up this part with looking back on the past, what is it, almost 5 years?
Almost 6 years. Almost 6 years.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest thing you take away from it for your future endeavors?
Just thinking about it made me tear up. My partnership with Sarah is the most impactful relationship of my life outside of my family. Our ability to trust one another to do the work I think that we were both called to do is foundational to what has become the outlier that exists today. And I am not a person that I think is easy to partnership or easy person to partner with. And so I've had to learn how to become a better partner. I've had to learn how to become a better friend. I've had to learn how to lean on someone and to be vulnerable and transparent in moments where my gut probably would have told me to hide from vulnerability and transparency. And I am walking away with a friend for life, of course, but also having built something with someone who taught me more than I could have hoped for the day I walked in. And so I think that that is my biggest takeaway. And yes, the work is important and valuable, and that is right up there with it. But I think I really have to lean into the value and potency of my partnership with Sarah.
All right. So now for the rapid fire questions, and my questions will be quick, but your answers don't have to. And I might even ask you to elaborate. So the first one, compared to a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
More-ish. I needed that ish. There are things that give me a lot of pause, and there are things that light me up. Things that light me up, someone like Maritza at Connected Arizona finally getting investment. That lights me up. Foundation building newsrooms gives me a bit of pause because I like things that are built out of community naturally. But that's not a right or wrong. It's just that's why I use the word pause. It gives me some pause.
Does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
Dread, deep dread, bad dread, all dread. And I've been told not to feel this way. They keep telling me I shouldn't feel this way, but I am a avid reader of Afrofuturism and Black sci-fi, and so as an Octavia Butler fan, deep pause. But I'm told I shouldn't feel that way.
By the way, I read Parable of the Sower after 2016, and it was shocking how prescient that was.
I mean, if I don't, but I do not believe in time travel, but Octavia Butler might be a time traveler. Uh, but also, as she and many other sci-fi writers have said, it only feels like the future because in the present you don't pay enough attention to how bad things actually are. Right. So they're actually often like, what's the thing about 1984 that it was really about 1948, but if he would have said that, folks would have freaked out.
Messy desk or clean desk?
Oh, very messy, wildly, in fact. But that's not true. Cluttered, because I actually don't believe in mess. It's a very clean environment. I'm always Lysoling it down, but it's a little, it's a little. I keep every notebook. If I have a job, for the time that I have that job, every notebook I have written in while I had that job, I own until I leave that job. Keep your notes, people. Keep your notes.
Best piece of advice you've been given?
When I first got this job, I was going to quit it because I didn't know what I was doing, and I was in my head failing. And this is like 3 months in, by the way. So I told someone this, and I really wish I could remember who said this to me, but I remember the advice, not the person. And I said, I'm failing. I'm going to quit. I'm going to fail Sarah and Outlier and blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, have you ever been a startup nonprofit newsroom leader? And I said, no. They said, well, then why would you know how to do it? Your job is to learn how to do your job right now. And if you can't figure out how to do the job, then call me back later. Your job sometimes is to learn how to do the job. You do not have to be an expert the day you walk in the room, but what you do have to be always is curious and committed to getting the work done.
Is there a piece of common advice or conventional wisdom that that drives you crazy in its oversimplification or just wrongness?
Sustainability is the future because often people are talking about money and nothing is sustainable because of money. Money is a tool, right? It is not the thing. It is but a tool. We've used many things in exchange for money throughout history, and they have worked just fine until they didn't. And I think that right now, the over dependence on capitalism and over dependence on consumption because of capitalism is failing us. And somehow we are still believing that that is the thing that will save us and particularly save delicate information systems. Capitalism doesn't wouldn't even want to save something like an information system. It would be anti its very purpose.
You're about to go to the home of Fail Fast, where failure is valorized, but we don't talk about it enough, I think, in journalism, because sometimes failure puts you in a much better place or teaches you a lesson you needed to learn. Do you have a favorite failure?
My God, all of them. I fail constantly. I mean, I fail so hard. Huh. But favorite is hard, but the one I learned the most from is when I first started WDET, I was tasked with putting together this event where we were going to cover the Detroit bankruptcy 4 years later. And it was a big event that was going to, where we invited the mayor, the judge that oversaw the bankruptcy, the governor and like all of these newsrooms to come together for this live event at Wayne State University. And this is a big thing, and we got it done. They all agreed to appear. It was going to be live to tape for our PBS station. Big deal. And we knew there would be protest, right? Because if you can remember, there are pensioners that gave up their pensions for the bankruptcy. And so I was pretty new to not media, but journalism. And so I was listening to the folks who were journalists and building this, and not to my innate ability to build community and to understand community need. And the protesters kept saying something about Flint. And I was mad because they were interrupting my event, my big fancy event. Had I listened to those protesters, had I talked to those protesters, I would have heard a story about an emerging crisis happening in a city about an hour away from Detroit. And instead, I cared about protecting the governor and the mayor and the judge and the journalist and the production and not the people we were there to serve. I was fortunate that a group of those protesters, through a friend of mine, invited a few of us to a church basement to have a conversation about what had happened at that event and the inappropriateness of the event. And I will not tell you that I left that church basement completely changed, but that conversation set in my spirit over time. And I am now, I would never do an event like that. That just would never occur to me to have a moment like that now. And I am grateful that there were people in this community willing to pull, as they say, pull your slip, willing to pull my slip and say, hey, little girl, sit down, because you don't actually know everything that you think you know. And just because the fancy folks have endorsed you, it does not mean that you're doing the right thing.
What's one thing you do to restore yourself and maintain your sanity?
I spend as much time as I can with one of my dear surrogate mothers who decided to actually make money by working in a for-profit business. And she winters on an island and allows me to stay with her as much as I want to. And so I try to get to her as much as I can, not just because it's a beautiful island with gorgeous beaches, but because she is one of the smartest, kindest human beings I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And sitting under her tutelage is a gift that people would pay good money for, and I get to do it for free.
Do you have a favorite time-saving hack?
Trust the people on your team to do their job. Often I find that leaders are overcommitted because they're still doing jobs that they actually hire people to do. Stop micromanaging your team.
So we talked a little bit about Detroit. We talked a good bit about Detroit. What are 3 to 5 places or activities that you would recommend to someone visiting Detroit?
You have to walk the Riverwalk. It is has been voted the greatest river walk in the country. I don't care about the votes. It's true. It's beautiful. And you'll have a gorgeous view of Windsor, Ontario, because we sit on the border of Canada. It is incredible. It's a beautiful walk, and I do it almost every day. Go to Source Booksellers. Source Booksellers is owned by an incredible woman named Miss Janet. It has been here for many, many, many moons. Miss Janet is the person, and that bookstore is the place I go to when the world gets really stupid and I can't understand it. I walk in there and she fixes my brain every time with the simplest possible words, because she's the most well-read human being I know. And she can take all of that knowledge and like dice it down to one sentence. So Source Booksellers is absolutely at the top of that list of places people should be going. The other place is to go see a concert at the Aretha Franklin Amphitheater. It was named after, it used to be called Shane Park. It sits right on the water. It is maybe one of the greatest concert views, maybe outside of Red Rocks in Colorado. It gives you that feeling like you're like, this is an experience. This is beautiful. You'll also be looking out at Canada. Once again, we got a lot, we got a whole thing with Canada. And then I would say finally is to go. It's a tie. Oh no. Okay, if you're here on a Saturday, go down to Eastern Market, which is one of the oldest continuously running farmers markets in the country. It's a great vibe. If you want to see Detroit be in Detroit, Eastern Market. You'll hear folks singing the blues over in this corner and somebody playing a banjo in this corner. And if that's not Detroit, I don't know what it is. And then I think finally, go spend some time at Motor City Wine on a Friday night listening to some of the greatest musicians in the country who sometimes jam there for free.
And I have to ask, is there a hole-in-the-wall restaurant you'd recommend?
Oh, how many? Yeah. So you're gonna go into Eastern Markets and you go to Eastern Market and you go to Cutters. Cutters Bar and Grill. It's been, but you know what? They remodeled recently, or like in the last couple of years, and I'm like, this is not the Cutters I grew up with. These kids don't know the carpet. They used to have carpet in a bar and grill, and that carpet had been there for decades, and it was filthy, and the food was delicious.
All right. And then final questions, 3 to 5 pieces of media you would recommend to the audience. And these can be entertainment, nonfiction, podcast, TV shows, news media, whatever.
If anyone is trying to understand a part of what it was like to grow up in Detroit in the 80s and 90s, I could not encourage them to listen more to Tanya Mosley's podcast, She Has a Name. It is, I think maybe the last episode is coming up soon, so you'll be able to catch the whole thing. It chronicles the story of her sister, who, and I won't say more than that. It's an incredible journey that I think the audience should take.
Also a JSK alum.
Also a JSK alum. I have no bias towards JSK alums. I need to talk about like a Neiman alum. Shout out to Wendy Thomas at MOK 50. Actually, you know what? Wendy Thomas's investigation into the hospital in Memphis, I think is necessary reading for anyone who wants to understand how you return material goods back to a community through reporting. It should be taught. It should be a J school course. Wendy's ability to, I mean, Wendy is one of the greatest investigative reporters in the country. It is rooted in her understanding of Memphis. Very few people would have been able to get that story done the way Wendy got it done and create the impact that Wendy was able to create. So if you want to understand that part of the world, that's a great piece of media to take in. Okay. Okay. Oh, should I go here? Yeah, I'm going to go here. Beyonce's Renaissance album. And I want to pick, I'm a music lover. I'm a amateur DJ. So that was a really hard choice for me to make because I really want to say Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace album, but we talk so much about Detroit. I think Beyonce's Renaissance album is incredible because as a woman who is the same age as Beyonce, I am just now getting into a place where I feel like I can be all of myself. And that album, the moment I put it on, I was like, oh, this is a woman who is becoming herself. Not who people told her she should be, not what management said she should be, not what her husband thinks she should be, not just someone's mother, not just someone's daughter, but the woman herself. And a lot of my therapy work has been about figuring out how to be the fullness of my womanhood, both a leader in an industry, but also Candice who has dreams and visions that are far outside the production that I do every day in order to make money. And so finally, I mean, we already said it, Parable of the Sower. If you've not read Parable of the Sower, you should, if you can handle it. Octavia Butler is one of the greatest gifts this country has ever received. And that piece of work, and you should also do the full series, but Parable of the Sower is, I think, foundational for people to understand what a future might look like if we don't get in front of it.
Well, Candice, thank you very much. This has been a treat.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.